Well, let's begin the seminar on how I teach CFA content, my philosophy about how I approach this process. And to do that, I want to lead into it by, we'll look at some pass rates. We'll try to explain why these pass rates are so low. And we'll explain, or at least position the CFAI context in some kind of philosophy of education. Then we'll see how we can solve some of the problems there. Let's start with the pass rates. And they seem rather low, but I'll try to put that in context for you. Level 1, 43% pass. Level 2, 45. Level 3, 53. The 43 and the 45 are from the 2018 exam, from the June exam. The 53% is more of a long-term average for level 3. I don't anticipate that that would change very much. And we may think that those are very low pass rates. If we look at level 1, 57% fail. How is that? They're actually much lower than that. When we look at 43%, we think, well, 43% of people are candidates pass the exam. That's 43% of those who actually show up, not 43% of those registered. Typically, 15 to 20% will not show up. For those of you who have been through the exam, you're sitting in the room. If you look around, you'll see a lot of empty seats. Those were booked seats. Those are people who simply just decided, well, I'm not going to show. So if we had 100 people, 100 candidates, take level 1, that 43% doesn't mean 43 candidates passed. If we assume that 20 didn't show up, that means only 35 passed. It's 43% of the 80. So only 35 got through. Level 2, 45%. Level 3, 53%. Well, what's going on here? These are not uneducated people sitting for these exams. Typically, an undergraduate degree is required, at least for level 2 and 3. For level 1, you can be in your final year. I know there's a small opening for those who do not have an undergrad degree, but have a lot of experience, a lot of real-world experience already. There is an exception there. But for the most part, well over 90% of candidates have been through the university system. And they passed and they graduated. Why all of a sudden are these rates so low? Well, there are two reasons. Number one, the pass rate for CFA is not 50%. I've been to some schools, or not been, but aware of some schools where the pass rate is 50%. Some, the pass rate is 60%, some 65%, some are 70%. Good graduate programs, the pass rate, or the pass grade, I shouldn't say the rate, the grade is 75%. You need 75% to pass. And if you're in key schools like medical school, the pass rate is, the passing grade is significantly higher. You're talking 90 to 95%. And that's what you'd want out of a doctor, right? You don't want a doctor who graduated with a 70% average. 30%. It's the 30% they don't know that'll kill you, right? So the problem with looking at that kind of thing is this. As a university professor, we cannot fail 57% of our class. We simply can't do it. We would never get away with that. Especially at a graduate level, it would be a rare case where you would actually fail someone. There'd be questions asked of why a person failed. Clearly, they had the ability and capability to enter the graduate program. Why suddenly did you fail them? So you have a lot of grade inflation in university where the grades and the passing rates aren't really true. Now, I shouldn't say the word true, but they're manufactured to a certain degree. In any first-year course, we have a target range of which our class average must fall within. And we have to structure our assignments and our midterms and our exams such that we end up within that range. If we're too high, well then at our review we're told that we're not rigorous enough. We haven't made our classes rigorous enough, and we need to increase the difficulty of what we're doing. If it's too low, then we're being far too rigorous given the level that we're at, and we have to lighten up a little bit. So with each assignment, with each midterm, we reassess where we are. We look at our class average and we think, okay, well, the final I've got to make much more difficult because my class average is too high, or the final I got to make easier because my class average is too low. Well, that doesn't happen with CFAI. There's a question and an answer, and that's it. And there is no There's no grade fixing after. There's no grading on a curve. Whoever passes, passes. Whoever fails, fails, and that's it. So that's why it's a little bit different. So if universities did that, if there was a set curriculum and there was a set exam and it was you get this grade and you pass, if you don't, you don't, you would have a much higher failure rate at university than what you currently do. But that simply wouldn't work very well because we need seats in the chairs for the next year. You have to get people through the system and you have to keep them in the system. So when we look at these pass rates, we may think that, well, there's no reason for these exams to be so difficult. Now here's the thing, they're not. They're not difficult at all. They're easy. At a university level, if we take level 1 exam, at a university level, we could never get away with having a final exam based on multiple choice questions like that, with only 3 options and questions that are pretty much straightforward right out of the textbook. You never get away with that. That would just be considered lazy. The exams at a university level are far more intense, but they're little bits at a time. It's not 3,000 pages of content in one exam. It might be this exam is going to be on these 5 chapters. And so there's only 5 chapters that you have to do, so you can spend a lot of time on those 5 chapters and do well. But the exam that you get out of CFAI is much easier than you would get out of any upper level university course. Even at a master's level, you'd never get away with this kind of stuff. So why are these pass rates so low? By the way, passing all 3 in a row, I've done the calculation here for you. If these are the pass rates at each level, passing all 3 in a row, you've got just a little over a 10% probability of being one of the people who can pass all 3 in a row. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's just the way that it's structured and the way that most candidates approach the content and approach the material is a little bit wrong. So let's look at what the problems are here. Let's go to what we have. All 3 levels are big. Let me see if I can get color on the screen here. Are big. Anywhere from 2,500 to 3,600 pages per level. Level 3 has only 37 readings, so it has the lowest amount of pages, but level 1, 3,600 pages over 6 books. Level 1 has 58 readings, level 2 has 51, level 3 has 37. And these are not 10 or 20 page readings. These are 40, 50, 60, 70, sometimes up to 100 pages. It's what you'd get in an ordinary textbook. So think about that. If you had an exam and the professor said, okay, the midterm exam is going to be on the first 58 chapters of the book, you'd drop. What do you mean? One exam, 58 chapters? Come on. So it's big. There's a lot to do. This is the biggest drawback. It is self-directed study. When I say the biggest drawback is because it requires discipline and motivation. When you have a calendar and when you have dates on a calendar, so Mondays and Wednesdays you must be in this room with this professor at these times and he will impart knowledge to you or she will impart knowledge to you. 3 weeks in there's a case study due. 6 weeks in there's a midterm. 9 weeks in your group presentation. 12 weeks you're going to have your final exam. So your full grade is broken down into 4 little chunks that if you miss on one of them you can try to salvage the grade on the other 3. You get feedback at a regular basis. So you have these repetitive assessments. There is no such thing for CFA. It is one exam, do or die. It's the whole thing and there's no direction. You're on your own. So self-directed study is probably the largest contributor to the failure rate because most candidates will underestimate how much time it will take them to go through all of that material. They will think, well, I got through university. I can get through this. Not realizing that, but you got through university only because there was a wave that carried a lot of people through university. We had to pass so many people. It is rather difficult to fail in university. You really got to mess up to fail. So it's more, the pass rates at university are more a function of the business model than it is the educational model. That I can tell you firsthand. It is a business model, not an education model. I did fail a student once for a course who then appealed the failure, who then had all his assignments regraded by another professor and got a grade that squeaked him by and they gave it to him. and he wasn't going to let it go anyways. It was his last course. It was just a terrible performance, but you had to pass him. That was it. The administration sided with the student. Yeah, he passes. Even though they recognize that this is poor performance, look, it's the business model. It's what we got to do. Well, that's not a business model at CFAI. And finally, it's one exam. Pass or fail. You're betting everything on one exam. Imagine if all your undergrad courses were like that. There's one exam. The entire semester is based on just one exam. There's no room to mess up. In most undergrad courses, you mess up on a midterm, well, you can salvage that. That's easy to salvage. You can visit the professor after, you can ask questions, you can ask for a rewrite. A lot of professors give rewrites. They'll give another exam or they'll give another assignment for extra grades. You can work your way to a pass. Can't do that here. So take these three things in context. It's big, there's a lot, it's self-directed study, and it's all one exam. Pass or fail. Then you start to look at these pass rates and you start to say, well, those pass rates probably make sense. If universities did that and they threw out the business model and they said, we're going to be true to an academic model and not a business model, and we're going to do it this way, yeah, your pass rates would probably be there. So when we look at these rates, we can't say, oh, it's got to be so rigorous. No, it's not rigorous. It's just honest. It's intellectually honest at this point. Here is the other drawback of I shouldn't say so much it's a drawback, it's a limitation. Let's call it a limitation with the way that candidates have to progress through the levels. There is a philosophy of education called essentialism. And essentialism basically says, look, there is some stuff you got to know, period. And that's what we're going to teach you, this stuff that you got to know. So there's a fixed content. And we want to make sure everybody knows it, so there's a standardized test that everybody takes. Now, if you think about university, think about any first-year course that is a survey course, where there's 200-300 people in a lecture hall. That course delivery will be based heavily on essentialism. There'll be a fixed content, there'll be standardized tests and standardized assignments, and that's it. Now go to an upper year course where you may get to choose the group project that you work on or the individual thesis that you write, especially at a master's level. You choose your thesis, you choose your advisor, you choose the research that you want to do that's interesting to you. Well, you don't have that anywhere in any of the three levels. Here's the content. This is what you got to know. There are learning objective statements that are very clear. You must know this as it's written. Explain this. Compare these two things. Contrast, calculate, interpret. That's it. It's very, very straightforward what you're expected to know. Everyone's expected to know the same thing, and there's a standardized test. And you may think, well, why is that a limitation? That seems to me almost a strength that takes some pressure off, right? Well, the problem is that we don't always learn effectively when material is delivered in an essentialist way, because we're then left with the choice of saying, well, there's a lot of information here, and the fallback learning position, which is the lowest level of learning, is memorization. I got to memorize this stuff. Because we don't get to work with the content in such a way that we can internalize it, that we can understand it. Let me give you an example. Let's say that I give you a situation about a business, and I write it out and I say, well, this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened, and I give it to you and I say, here you go. We're going to have an exam on this. Well, you'd go through those 5 or 6 pages of information that I gave you and the exhibits and the financials, and you'd say, okay, well, you try to remember as much as you can because I'm going to ask you questions. Now, fast forward to year 4. When you're in a policy and strategy course and you have a case. What do? It's class discussion. You debate a point. You argue a point, because there's never any one right answer. There's never one single way to do things. There's good and bad execution, but there's no wrong answer. Any strategy will work if executed well. So you get to actually wrestle with the idea. You get to push your ideas off on someone else, and they'll push back against you. And that 1-hour class discussion is far more memorable than trying to memorize a list of facts about the company and having just one opinion about what went wrong. So that kind of thing, that progressivism in the classroom, that class discussion, that give and take, you become more engaged in the material. It becomes part of your thinking. It forms into a story, and you can recall that better. You can remember it better. I remember back in my undergrad days, in any case course, I can still remember a lot of the cases and a lot of the companies we talked about and the situation that they were in. But if you say, well, what about HR? Oh, HR. I did have to take an HR course, and say, well, can you remember some of the chapters and what they were about? Vaguely. There were no case studies in that. It was all just a bunch of writing on pages, chapter after chapter, of really boring stuff. I can't remember any of it, really. I remember it was boring. It wasn't exciting at all. See, our minds are not set up to remember lists of facts. The more we engage with a problem, the more we discuss it, push back on it, agree with it, disagree with it, the more we can internalize it. Well, that's absent at the 3 levels of CFAI. It's absent. It's somewhat there at level 3, somewhat, if you have a good teacher that can guide you through it, but it's really missing at the other levels. So because of this essentialist perspective, we don't get to really work with the content. So that means our job is harder as candidates. As students going through this, our job is harder because now we don't get to actually engage that way. We have to think about it in terms of, well, I guess I have to memorize this, right? Well, let's go on to the next page and we'll contrast memorization with understanding. All right, let's look at what memorization involves. Memorization is remembering the words as they were written on the screen. In other words, you're memorizing their words. Memorization sits in short-term memory. It's temporary, which is when we hear about people cramming for an exam, that's what they're doing. They're trying to stuff as much stuff into short-term memory as possible. They're memorizing what they can walk in the exam with, and they're just going to dump it on the page. Memorization works for facts. If you have a bunch of facts, well, yeah, memorization works. Now, I'm not saying that there's nothing at level 1, level 2, or level 3 that memorization won't help you with. There's quite a bit where, well, for a lot of these things, unless you can work with it in some particular way, yeah, you have to memorize certain things. So for level 1, fixed income, the difference between a domestic bond, a foreign bond, and a euro bond, well, if you're not familiar with fixed income, if you've never worked with it before, if it's not second nature to you, then you have to think, okay, well, domestic bond is this, foreign bond is that, euro bond. You do have to memorize some of those things. So I'm not saying that don't memorize anything. My point that I'm going to make is that you can't memorize your way through these 3 levels. But I'm not saying that there isn't points where you can. Memorization works for facts, but not for concepts. So at level 1, it's about 50-50. There's a lot of facts, a lot of language of finance that you have to be familiar with, a lot of terms, a lot of definitions, a lot of those things to get you up to speed about what things are, how we look at things, the idea of valuation, how you value it. Not so much the process of valuation yet, that's big at level 2, but a lot of the foundation for moving forward. So the better you do at level 1, the better your foundation is, the more solid a house you can build at level 2 and 3. Level 2 is more heavier on conceptual issues, and this is huge at level 3, are the conceptual issues. You cannot memorize your way through that. You might get through level 1, but you'll be stopped at level 2. And even if you squeak past level 2 with this strategy, you will be stopped at level 3 because you can't memorize those kind of things. So I don't teach that way. I recognize that we have an essentialist program, and I think, well, how can we bring something more into this if there's proper instruction along the way? And that's the role of a teacher. The role of a teacher is not to tell you what you can read. And I see a lot of that. I watch other providers. I watch their videos on YouTube because I like to see how other people do things. I admire great teaching, and there's a lot you can learn from a great teacher, but a lot of what I see is a PowerPoint up on the screen and somebody repeating the words and underlining words as they talk, and they're really just reading the words off the screen. They're telling you what the words are. They're telling you what's in the book. Telling is not teaching. Telling really is just pointing out, look, you should know this, you should know this, you should know this, you should know this. They're telling you what to know, but they're not telling you how to know it. That's the difference between telling and teaching, and I'll talk about that at the bottom here. So I approach this in a different way. I say, look, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm going to explain for understanding. That's it. So if you look at level 1, my level 1 content, look at the videos for level 1, there are 58 readings at level 1, and total hours of my videos, 120 hours to cover those 58 readings. And some of the videos, some readings, the video can be up to 3 to 4 hours long. It doesn't need to be. I can make it much shorter. I can make it an hour and a half. I can go through all of these readings very, very quickly if I dispense with the explanation. If I say, look, it's up to you to understand it, I'm just going to tell you what you need to know. Yeah, I could do level 1 in 50, 60 hours, 1 hour per reading. That'd be good. But that still doesn't help you. So I do take more time. And my goal on every learning objective is to say, okay, I'm going to explain it so that you understand it. And how I know, or how you know that you understand it, is you can then turn around to somebody else and explain it to them. And if you can do that, that's the goal of teaching. So I teach for understanding. In other words, instead of using their words, which you would use in memorization, you're going to use your words. That means you can explain what you just heard in your own words. You don't have to memorize their words. You know exactly what it is. If you want to understand something well, explain it to somebody else. And that's the goal. So I do take a little bit longer. I lay out the foundation. Maybe there's a formula there. Well, how did that formula come to be? And is there something you should have known before we got to this formula? Is there some background information that if you had just that one extra point, you would say, oh, okay, that answers a question that I would have had. And having been in a classroom for many years, I can anticipate where the questions are. So you should seek to be able to explain everything as opposed to just try to remember everything. And that brings you closer to understanding. Understanding is more permanent, by the way, as opposed to being temporary. You're putting it in long-term memory. And even going into an exam, if it's in your long-term memory, if it's permanent, you didn't have to rely on memorizing it. So you can read a question and go, well, you know, I didn't have to worry about cramming the night before because this is part of me now. I know what the answer here. Understanding is obtained by doing. In other words, more time on problems. Reading the chapter, watching the video, reviewing your notes, memorizing these things is not going to help you. That's the wrong way to approach this. Your goal is to get to the end of the chapter questions as fast as possible. That's where the real understanding begins to happen. And don't worry about getting to the problems in such a way that you're going to get them all right. So many high achievers feel the need to say, look, I'm not ready to do the problems because I'm going to get them wrong. Yeah, that's the point. Get them wrong. That's where learning happens. You don't learn by doing things right. If you do something once and you get it right, well, how do you know you got it right? Because you know it. Can you repeat it? Can that happen again and again? If you really want to learn, don't spend all that time on the front end making sure you have it right first before you head into the problems. Head into the problems right away. Make mistakes. Watch how quickly you learn when you make mistakes. So your goal is to get to the problems as fast as you can. Repetition. Repetition. Again and again and again. As many as you can. As many problems from as many sources as you can. So we have a bunch of quizzes on our site. And what we do is we'll write out a question. And let me call it Form 1. We'll write a question in a particular form. And then we will copy this question and we'll call it Form 2. And what we'll do is we'll change a couple of things. So they'll be slightly different in the next question. It'll be kind of the same question, but a slightly different version. And this one you'll find in quiz number 1. This one here you might not see again till quiz number 3. And then at quiz number 7, you'll probably see this again, but in a slightly different form. So that can you recognize the same scenario when you get to it and recognize that, you know what, even though this is worded differently and said differently, it's the same situation. Because that's what life is. Life is not a series of infinite problems. It's a series of a finite set of problems in an infinite set of situations. So you might look at 10 different situations and say, well, these are not 10 different problems. This is the same problem. It just looks different because it's 10 different contexts. So the quizzes and the questions, the repetition, is really meant to reinforce this whole idea of understanding. Can you see the context is different, but the problem is the same, that you requires the same solution, and maybe you have different information each time. Given a choice of reviewing notes or doing problems, always do problems. So on our site, what we're doing now is we have 3 outside contract writers who are very, very good. We've gone through I can't tell you how many contract writers to get to where we are now, and we add 75 to 100 questions every single week, and that will never end. That is ongoing. That will never, ever, ever end, because that's where the gold is. The videos, the readings, that's all necessary stuff. You need all of that. But you need that. That's the pathway to the end target, which is to get you to the end of chapter questions as fast as possible, to get you to the quiz questions as fast as possible. Any question bank you find there, anywhere, CFAI under Candidate Resources is expanding their question bank. From what we understand, they're going to continue every year to add more and more to their question bank. The end of chapter questions at each of the 3 levels are, I think, comprehensive, and there's lots of them. There's lots of extra question banks out there. There's no shortage of that out there. So let's just sum up and sort of look at the focus that I take. Understanding, not memorization, and my videos are made for understanding, which is why they're long, yes. And you can probably find a provider out there that has level 1 videos of 60 hours and think, oh, in 60 hours I'll be done. With Meldrum, I got to do 120 hours. Forget it. That's way too long. Well, what do you get in the end? At the end of 60 hours, you're getting an assignment that says, now go back and memorize that stuff. At the end of my 120 hours, guess what? There's a lot of stuff you don't have to memorize. You're going to be much further ahead because you're going to start to internalize some of that stuff. And you'll understand how something came to be. You won't just accept it. Oh, well, I don't know how this formula came about, but I guess I'll just have to accept it. Well, now you have to memorize it. And what if you were faced with a question where you had to manipulate that formula somewhat, where you had to change it somewhat? You couldn't do it because you can't derive it. So I focus heavily on that understanding, which is, I think, academically honest. If you were sitting in my university class, I could never just throw you a formula and say, here you go. I got to derive that for you. That's part of understanding how that formula came about, so that now you are in a position to work with it, to manipulate it if you need to understand when to use it and when not to use it. Explanation, not just repeating. So I explain the words that I have written on my screen. I don't just repeat them. I don't just put words on a screen and read off the screen. I explain what they are. So yeah, there are times where I'll go off on a 2-minute explanation about something and you'll think, oh, this is, just get to the next point. Well, there's a reason why I'm doing this. You'll remember these things. I try to bring in as many real-world examples as I can. So I'll be explaining something, I'll say, for example, take this company at this period of time. Here's what they did. We remember stories. We attach to those much better. And yes, there are times where I'll go off on a 3 or 4 minute rant about something. And there's reason for that. It's not as if I think, well, this is on my mind, I'm just going to talk about it right now. You need breaks. You need cognitive breaks every now and then. So every now and then there'll be a joke. I think they're funny, but I'll throw a joke in because it breaks that tension. It gives you a little bit of a break. Every now and then I'll do a little rant about something in the world that I don't like. And it gives you that cognitive break. So it's not a haphazard thing that I throw in. There is thought behind that. I do that in classes too, where if the class is sort of drifting and I feel it's not going anywhere, then I'll take it to a different place for a period of time just to get everyone's attention, because it's new, it's interesting, it's something that's not the same thing. And now you're ready to come back to the topic after. Teaching, not just telling. What's the difference here? I don't know if you ever heard the expression sage on a stage. And this is why I mentioned that essentialism is sort of a bit of a drawback as a teaching philosophy, only because there's a fixed content and you're expected to know this, so that the role of the teacher is to impart that knowledge to you. And a lot of times it ends up being the sage on a stage where somebody just stands there and tells you what they know. I will tell you what I know, and then you will know it. That doesn't work. So I don't tell you what I know. I tell you how to know what I know. That's teaching. That's a difference between teaching and telling. There are a lot of tellers out there, And I'm sure you go into any university, and I don't think I'm underestimating when I say about half the professors you have simply just tell you stuff. They don't teach it to you, they simply just tell you stuff. They'll put a PowerPoint up and they'll proceed to read the words off the PowerPoint as if you can't read them yourself. As if somehow their reading of the PowerPoint changes the quality of the words, and all of a sudden you go, oh, see, when you say it, I understand it, but when I read it, it was really confusing. There's a lot of professors out there. I think the reason is because universities don't hire teachers, they hire researchers, and then they think researchers can teach. I don't know why they think that, but it is not everyone that has the skill to teach. Anybody can stand up and tell you stuff. Ask anybody to say, what do you know? And they'll tell you what they know, but they miss the idea of telling you how to know what they know. So I teach, I don't tell. I explain, I don't repeat. I seek to get you to understanding so you don't have to rely on memorization. That being said, though, yeah, there are still some things that are facts that, yeah, you're still going to have to memorize some things. There's no getting away from that. But hopefully with the understanding, it lightens the load that you don't all of a sudden have to think this is a 100% memorization process. I just got one more screen to go through because I get asked a lot of questions about, should I read the book first, then listen to the video? Should I listen to the video first, then read the book? And it depends on how you like to learn. There is some strategy there, so let's just finish that one up. All right, so there are not very many words on this screen. Let me put this in a bit of a context for you first. How many people have read a chapter of CFAI, and as you're reading and turning the page, you stop and you think, I can't even remember what I just read. Like if you asked me what that last page said, I couldn't remember a thing. That all that's really happening is your eyes are passing over the words. Your brain is recognizing each word as a word, and you know what each word is. But as far as the ideas and the concepts and the thoughts, well, that left after page 3, that you're just not absorbing what you're reading. Well, let's look at it in terms of video now. How many people have been watching a particular video, and then after about half an hour in, you're thinking, okay, you know what, I don't even know what just happened in the last 5 minutes. My mind drifted. And that happens. Your mind drifts. It gets taken away. It doesn't do that in movies because movies are entertaining. And there's a story, there's a theme throughout, and you want to see what happens next. Textbooks and lectures are not that interesting. You don't really care to see what happens next. There's no big whodunit in the end. There's no plot twist. So it requires active listening and active reading. You actually have to force yourself to pay attention. And it depends on what you want to learn from, what you want to pay attention to, where you want to put your active energy. So if you read first, then listen, learning will depend on active listening. You've read first, you got an idea of what's written in that chapter. You may not be able to recall it or really understand the concepts or have much recall about the reading at all. But then when you start listening to it, you go, okay, I remember seeing that. I remember reading this. Oh, okay, so that's what that means. You have to actively listen. If you listen first, then read, yeah, your mind will wander. You might not get everything out of the video, but when you start reading the chapter, you go, I remember this, I heard this. Okay, that's what that means. That relies on active reading. So it depends on which one you want to be more active with. Do you want to engage in active listening for your learning or active reading for your learning? And that's the order that you would choose. If you want to actively listen to learn, read the book first. Now, when you read the book first, you're not reading it deeply. You're going to read it a good first pass through. Don't worry that you're not understanding everything or that you can't recall everything or that you couldn't explain what you're reading. Just read it, so that when you see it in the video, you recognize it and it starts to make more sense. You can tie it to something. If you prefer to get your learning through the reading, then watch the video first, sort of just to get a good layout of what's in the reading. Get a better explanation of some of the more difficult concepts so that when you get to those parts of the book where it does get a little bit thick, you could say, okay, you know what, it makes sense to me because I've had it explained to me already. And yeah, that's the way I would use the videos and the reading. So I do get asked that, do I watch first then read, or do I read first then watch? And it all comes down to you. Which way do you prefer being active, with listening or with reading? Well, that's it. That wraps up what I have to say here. The bulk of it was wrapped up in the first two, and I thought, well, let me throw this slide on because I do get this question. If there are any more questions, or if you have any questions at all, since this is on YouTube, just go ahead, throw it in the comment sections below, and I'll answer them. Or if anyone has some extra information that you find useful at all, or some links to some really good articles about learning. Or the learning process, feel free to throw them in the comment section below. And that's it.